Let's look at some French Empire officers' fighting swords. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, years ago, I made a video about this sword. That's right, this very sword, not this model of sword, this exact sword. And I incorrectly called it a French model 1882 infantry officer's sword. Now, as it transpired, this isn't a 1882 infantry officer's sword. It actually predates that, but this, in many ways, not this exact sword, but swords exactly like this, or very similar to this, were the basis for the 1882 infantry officer's sword in France. Now, let's just set some background context. So here we've got the fact that there is a sword, a non-regulation sword, which is what this is, providing the inspiration for a later model or pattern. This is something that we absolutely see with British swords. If I just put down this French sword for a second and I pick up this Royal Engineers sword, for example, you can notice this very attractive scroll hilt in brass. These scroll hilts weren't invented for the Royal Engineers in 1857. In fact, they'd been around since about 1850, perhaps even the late 1840s actually. For the Sind Irregular Cavalry, or at least according to the Wilkinson records, they were created for the Sind Irregular Cavalry. Now, what on earth is the Sind Irregular Cavalry? There was a guy called Brigadier General John Jacob, who I've talked about in previous videos, who essentially was involved in the conquest of Sind. Sind was then a region of India. It's now part of Pakistan, but essentially it was outside the British Empire and it became inside the British Empire due to British expansionism, colonialism, so forth. Now, they, on the frontiers, on the wild frontiers, they were actually using their swords. So unlike people in most parts of Europe, in most European wars, out on the frontier lands, in the far reaches of not just the British Empire, but also the French Empire, and we'll talk about that in a second, there was simply more kind of skirmishing actions, more combat. It seems, certainly from the swords that these types of soldiers, these types of officers chose and had designed, that they were more likely to come into hand-to-hand combat. And in fact, a lot of the hand-to-hand combat accounts we have from the 19th century, be it British or French or Belgian or Dutch or anything else, come from the colonies. They come from these outland places where these European forces, very often with native contingents of soldiers, are fighting in places like deserts or jungles or on rivers, where they're more likely to get into small engagements with hand-to-hand combat in. So their swords were more important to them. So in the British Army, we find certainly, in fact, many innovations and changes that we find with swords in the British Army come about principally through Indian warfare, not just India, but also Afghanistan, China, Sudan, other areas, South Africa, other areas as well, but principally from the outlying regions of the expanding empire. So this particular type of hilt was devised because it was very well balanced and protective and also looked good. And the Royal Engineers, a main part of the regular British Army, when they came to have their own pattern of sword, copied it, okay? But the inspiration was from those colonial officers. Now, many of you will also notice that I often talk about wooden field service scabbards. I actually can't see one around here to grab. They're a bit too far away. But wood and leather scabbards were another example of an innovation which came from service principally in India, but also other outlying parts of the empire, where essentially, because of the nature of the service, they designed a new type of scabbard that was a bit more practical for service. And this ultimately kind of replaced the steel scabbard for actual field service for the whole British Army. So something, and we see the same thing with the Sam Browne belt, for example, something that's designed for use for soldiers out in India, eventually through a kind of evolution of equipment, they go, well, this is so good, we're going to adopt it, and the entire British Empire, everywhere from Canada to Australia, starts using it. Also, the final British example I'll give is even swords like the mainstream 1912 cavalry officer's sword, which is still the regulation sword for British cavalry officers today for parade purposes. This is an example from World War I, carried by an officer of the 4th Dragoon Guards, as it's etched on the blade. A very, very nice sword, but this is a very peculiar and particular design of sword, and you know, it has some parallels with the American model 1911 pattern, 1913 pattern, which came after this. This is the 1911. and various other swords at the time as well. But a lot of the innovations on these swords were actually devised in colonial warfare. Okay, so a specialised thrusting blade, a canted pistol-like grip, these kinds of things. So very often, in a nutshell, very often we see innovations by colonial officers who are given more leeway to use the equipment that they deem best for actual combat. Ultimately, it shows itself to be better, more practical, and therefore it becomes adopted by the whole rest of the army at some point, or at least the officers of the whole rest of the army at some point. So this is absolutely something that we see in the British Army, and we see it in France as well. Now, particularly with officers' swords. So if we come back to the 1882, so I thought this was an 1882, model 1882 infantry officer sword. As it transpires, it's a Klingenthal made sword, almost certainly for an officer serving in North Africa. So that's the next thing to say, is on this channel we often refer to things within the British Empire, and you know about, I talk about engagements and conflicts obviously in India and China, Afghanistan, various parts of Africa, some cases North America as well. Remember, of course, that the Fenian raids, for example, incurred invasions into Canadian territory. So all over the British Empire. And that has a massive effect on the firearms that are chosen and used and prove themselves to be reliable and effective in different types of colonial warfare, but also swords as well. Now, France is no different, because in case you didn't know, and I'm sure most of you did know, basically after the British Empire, the next biggest empire in 19th century, certainly European empire in 19th century in the world, was France. Okay, now if the Napoleonic Wars had panned out slightly differently, then quite possibly the British Empire never would have come to be, or India maybe would have got its independence sooner, or may have become French, who knows. There's lots of what ifs, and that's always a fun game to play, but we'll never know. But the fact is that the French Empire was huge, and one of the principal areas of French colonialization was in North Africa. Okay, so most famously perhaps Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and in these regions there was lots of policing actions, but also lots of combat essentially of all sorts. There were various uprisings, and the fact is that swords did get used, and of course the people of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia used swords. Okay, so they used swords. In many cases not always, but in many cases they lacked the firepower of the French forces there. And so you could paint parallels here with the British Army, for example, against the Zulus or the Dervishes, the Sudanese, various other forces, where the enemy in some cases wanted to get to close combat because that's where they actually had an advantage, either because they had superior numbers or because they were better equipped and trained for close combat. But the French army in the 19th century was really the model which lots of other armies based themselves on. And it's no coincidence that if you look at American Civil War, certainly Union soldiers, and after the American Civil War, you look at American soldiers' uniforms, now have a look at French uniforms, and you'll notice that the French military heavily based not just their uniforms, also their models of sword. So for example, this sword behind me, which is a French 1822 light cavalry sword, was the basis for the US model 1840 and then later on the 1860 cavalry swords. So and the same is true of infantry officers as well. The 1850 field infantry officer's sword is based on the French 1845. So American swords were heavily based on French swords. Lots of other things, their uniforms, all sorts of things in the American forces were based on the French, and lots of other people copied the French as well. So French style swords were emulated in lots of different places in Europe. So when we come back to swords, what an interesting thing we see happen is that with these colonial serving officers in North Africa, they started to develop more of a sense of individual identity, I think, and they were given more leeway. They didn't necessarily have to use the regulation models. They could use whatever type of sword they liked. Now this of course relates heavily to a Colonel Mary Mong. Now there's a brilliant article by my friend Max that I will link below this video. He is way more knowledgeable on French swords than me, being a French Canadian himself, and he has discovered one of the innovative and very individualistic design swords by Colonel Mary Mong. Now I've known Mary Mong's works for going back probably to my early 20s that I first discovered it. And it survives to most of us in an English translation that was done by a British officer serving in India who had an interest in sword designs. Again, we get the comparison and almost collaboration between Britain and French, British and French kind of military thinking here. And he was very interested in Mary Mong's writings, which was in French, and he translated it into English and published it. Now, interestingly, that translation only survived the Indian Mutiny by chance, because during the mutiny the people who rose up basically ransacked a lot of the officers' belongings, and this guy's book, his translation, ended up in a ditch essentially, but it survived and it was found and it was reinstated to him later on. So anyway, that's a tangent, but the fact is that Mary Mong had lots of ideas about design. He didn't agree with all of the standard regulation French designs. He thought some of the British designs were interesting. He was interested in the 1796 light cavalry sabre, for example. So he wrote a very interesting work looking at some of the contemporary sword designs and saying what he thought was good and what he thought was bad. He was also heavily influenced by Indian and, shall we say, Turkish and Persian swords as well. So he does talk about talwars, he does talk about shamshir and kilich, he talks quite a lot about the yataghan. And anyway, check out Max's article below, because that will really expand and tell you more about that. But the fact is that he was a North African serving officer. So he had swords made to his own order, and he had swords made for his men as well. And this is exactly the same as we see in India. We see, you know, John Jacob, for example, doing exactly the same thing. He had specific ideas about how his swords should be, even down to the details of how the scabbards should be made and wooden lined to keep the sharpness of the edges and things like this, and how the throat of the scabbard should be made of softer metal than iron so that it didn't damage the edge when you drew it. A huge level of detail, and Mary Mong was essentially kind of like the French equivalent. So, to cut a long story short, there were officers in North Africa serving in the French army who were very individualistic and had very strong views about swords. Now, what is this sword, and how does it differ from an 1882? Well, essentially, it's very, very similar, okay? And the French 1882 model was based on these swords that go back to, I believe, about the 1860 era. So the 1860s and 70s, these became popular in North Africa. And then by 1882, presumably the powers that be in Paris or wherever went, well, this sword's really popular, let's just have that as our new model. So, the distinctive features are a straight, primarily thrusting blade. It has cutting capacity, okay, so it's a relatively narrow blade. Yes, indeed, spadroon-like, but it's relatively stiff and is principally a thrusting blade. Now, this completely tallies with the French mindset. So the French strongly believed in the superiority of the point. That's kind of ironic, considering that their most common cavalry sword is really quite curved. Okay. Now, that being said, what's amazing about these curved blades with an asymmetrical point is we know that they were taught to thrust with them. So it's weird. They kind of adopted this sword in 1822 and then spent most of their time telling people to thrust with it, which seems a bit odd. But anyway, there we go. Straight blade. Principally a thrusting blade, and you'll notice it has a hilt which is arguably influenced by British hilts. I think French people might take exception with me saying that. I think that it probably was influenced by British hilts. However, it must be admitted that the British sidebarred hilts in turn were sort of influenced by some French hilts that turned up in the later Napoleonic period. So it's a kind of backwards and forwards, but this was made with steel, and that is certainly this one's steel. In fact, the 1882 is more an alloy. It's a nickel metal. Okay, but it's a departure from brass, and that is interesting because traditionally French swords tended to have brass hilts, whereas British swords tended to have steel hilts, although there's exceptions to that. Right, so coming back to this sword, so it has you'll notice it has 1, 2, 3 branches on the side. So you've got a main knuckle bow, then 1, 2, 3. So we call this probably a 4-bar hilt, or they would have called it a 4-bar hilt. The grip on this particular example is, I believe it's buffalo horn. It's certainly horn of some kind. And then, interestingly, it has a smooth backstrap. Now, this is a pretty much universal feature. Now, when we look at British swords, if I just grab a similar period sword, actually. So if I grab this British sword here, you'll notice it has a checkered thumb placer here to keep your thumb in place when you're using the sword. I'm a big fan of these, and it's very useful if you're doing a lot of work with the point, okay, because it keeps the thumb on the back strap. I've always thought it's a bit odd that the French clearly wanted a thrusting sword, but they didn't put any kind of extra traction on the backstrap. It's quite a narrow backstrap, it's quite rounded, and it's completely smooth. The only possible thing I can think is that perhaps, based on the earlier use of the small sword and arguably the foil, perhaps they were actually holding it a lot of the time with the thumb actually on the side of the grip and not on the back of the grip. I don't know. That's pure conjecture. I don't know. If you know more about that topic, if you know the French, I know several people, in fact, who study the French Victorian era, or Third Empire, shall we say, Third Republic rather, treatises or manuals. Maybe you can explain that, but why didn't the French go for something with a bit more traction on the backstrap? I don't know, especially when, I mean, with British swords, we end up, the full evolution is you end up with a fully checkered backstrap, which gives a huge amount of traction. I'm a big fan of that. Why didn't they do that? I don't know. But anyway, it's a straight grip in line with the blade, great for thrusting in theory, and the hilt is all on one side, so it is an asymmetrical hilt. That actually goes against what Colonel Mary Mong says, because he was a big fan of equibalanced, as Wilkinson would call it, or an equal amount of mass on each side of the guard. This doesn't have that, so it is more likely to twist in the hand. Now, the cross section of the blade is very interesting. It is what I believe was called cannula. So if we look at the blade, you'll notice it has a fuller down this side, but on the other side, the fuller's here. So I flip that over, the fuller's still on as you're looking at it, to the right-hand side. I think that's right. So the fuller kind of goes in on this side, it goes down there, and on this side, it goes up there, which means that it's almost like a corrugation. If you cut through that blade with a laser and looked at it, it would look a bit like a corrugation. That means that it's kind of overall a diamond cross-section, a flattened diamond cross-section, a lozenge, but so with the fullers offset either side of the spine. Very interesting design. That's clearly not great for a cutting blade. You put a cutting edge on these, and they do often have cutting edges on them, but it is principally a thrusting blade. But it is a way of making a blade that's relatively stiff, relatively light. Okay. Now, what's interesting is if we go to another sword here. This is what we would probably call fantasy, as the French used to call it. So this is probably for a cavalry officer, I believe. But you'll notice it has a greater number of bars on the side, and the hilt here is made of alloy, nickel alloy. Okay, probably, I don't know, nickel mixed with brass or something like that, I think it was. And this does have a cannula blade, and this is a thrusting blade. This is longer, this is 35 inches, which I think probably indicates it was for a cavalry officer. But what's interesting is these come along right at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. So these are called fantasy designs because essentially the officers would just choose whatever elements, whatever blade, whatever hilt they liked. Although they were quite formulaic, they tend to obey certain sets, should we say, there were maybe 5 different types of hilt, 4 different types of blade, and they'd kind of mish and mash them however they wanted. And yeah, so there was just sort of before the First World War, in the sort of in British history from the Boer War to the First World War periods, kind of like 1900 to 1914, there was a spate of officers having these. I'm not really sure for the historical background why, but nevertheless, they follow the same formula of essentially having an asymmetrical multi-barred hilt and a straight cannula blade. Now, what's interesting, I'll just talk about the thrusting blade as opposed to cutting blades or whatever. If we look at non-regulation British swords, we actually see there's a wide variety of blade types. Some are specialised for thrusting, some are more specialised to cutting, some are sort of combination, compromised designs. If we look at Austro-Hungarian officers' non-regulation swords, they tend, from my observation, I'm not a specialist on them, to be more cutting swords. They seem to be more influenced by Turkish sabres, and indeed earlier Austrian sabres as well. So the British seem to be a mixture of cut and thrust. The Austrians seem to prefer the cut, but the French, without question, seem to have preferred the thrust. Not all of them, and you do indeed find some quite choppy French blades, and in fact Mary Mong's Yataghan blades are an example of that. They are a combination cut and thrust blade, trying to increase the power of the cut and have an effective thrust at the same time. And there are some French officers' swords from North Africa that do have whopping great curved broad blades on them and stuff like this. And I have had, in fact, one non-regulation French sword myself which had a broadsword blade in it, double-edged, quite broad cutting blade. But overall, certainly based on most of the examples I've had, the French, certainly for infantry officers, seem to have favoured thrusting blades. Now, I've got another... Oh, and one other thing I mentioned as well. So a difference between the, shall we say, the North African officers version and the later 1882. This is a steel hilt instead of nickel alloy. But also you'll notice these raised bars. I'll just come up close here. Can you see those raised bars reinforcing each of these? That is far more substantial and is really a feature of North African serving officers' swords. You do sometimes find it on other ones, and you do sometimes find it, I've seen it on swords which I believe to be 1882 patterns, but this feature is something that you absolutely find on those earlier, so this is, I don't know, I'm guessing 1860s, 1870s, pre-1882 anyway, North African officers' sword. Now, I've got another one here. So this is an interesting one. So yeah, I'll show this one next. So this, again, if we look at the hilt, you'll notice it's got black paint on it, probably from the Great War, probably original paint to help camouflage. And you'll notice this has got these raised ridges, exactly like I was just saying. It's got exactly the same kind of hilt, but it's not the, it doesn't seem to be the cast nickel, it seems to be steel hilt from what I can see where the paint's chipped off. But the blade isn't the cannula design. Now this type of blade is absolutely a blade that we also find on British swords. So the features, let me show you its features. It has two fullers and it's completely bar stock, essentially. It's a flat rectangular bar. It has no edges until we get up halfway up the blade. So it's a rectangular bar with two fullers front and back, and there is a shallow as well. It is shallowed in the middle, so there's a slight fuller in here. And then for the second half of the blade, get my face out of the way, there we go, the second half of the blade, it is double-edged and symmetrical with a spear point. This is known as a Toledo blade. Why? Because they were popular in Toledo. So this is a type of blade that basically seems to have come out of Toledo sword makers, Spanish, and was used on some Spanish officers' swords, and the French liked it and some of the British liked it, and they copied it on some officers' swords. It was never a regulation in Britain or France, but it did inspire certain later patterns. The principal example I would say is I think it probably inspired the British 1892 pattern blade as featured on the 1895 and 1897 pattern infantry officers' swords. I think this was probably where the original idea stemmed from. Anyway, so this is a Toledo style blade. So here we've got essentially a hilt like the other North African officer's sword we saw there, with a steel hilt with raised reinforced bars, asymmetrical, exact same style of grip. But instead of having the cannula blade, this has got the Toledo style blade. Possible advantages for this: it's a little bit lighter in the tip. It's quite a nimble sword, this, and the bottom of the blade is being completely blunt and thick, is very strong for parrying. So if someone puts in a whopping great cut, so long as you're parrying with the base of the blade, you can get a very strong parry in there, and it's not going to damage your blade because it's a bar down here. But then it leaves you with this nice light cutting and thrusting end of the blade that's incredibly nimble and quick, and you can thrust and cut with very, very easily. So essentially a dedicated parrying half of the blade and a dedicated cut and thrusting half of the blade. Is this better or worse than the Cannula blade? It's kind of 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. I think that overall, I probably prefer the Toledo blade, but they're so similar it'd be really difficult to choose. So a final example I have to show you here. This is the superior officers, so a higher ranking officer's blade, and you'll notice that this is a regulation blade that was around for a good chunk of the 19th century in France, and it's double-edged, symmetrical, and it has double fullers. Very attractive blade, and it goes from being double fullered for about the first 60% of the blade, and then the last 40% of the blade is double-edged and spear pointed. Okay, so that is more or less a regulation blade for a superior officer, a higher ranking officer. Why the French particularly went for essentially more of a dedicated thrusting blade, essentially kind of like a scaled down rapier blade really. Why they went for this for superior officers and then for lower ranking officers and sergeants, they had a sabre. Why that was, I don't know. And again, maybe Max or Julien Gary or someone else who's a specialist in French military of this era can expand on that. If you see this, that'd be very interesting to know. Maybe it's unknown, I don't know. I would imagine it's because the lower ranking officers, the sabre is somehow seen as more as a kind of a brawling, fighting sword, and then the guys who are less likely to fight rather, but are more likely to be sitting on a horse more of the time, maybe they thought a thrusting blade was more, I just don't know, I'm just guessing. But anyway, the fact is you had two types of blades for officers in standard use, and this is the superior officer's blade. So the blade is sort of interesting, but not hugely, it's regulation, but the hilt is really not regulation at all. First of all, note, it is a steel hilt again. So this is something we find again in the British Army in India. We find steel hilts are preferred over brass hilts because they are stronger, they protect your hand better, pretty simple. And this one is steel, but it's an unusual design. In some ways, it's quite British, okay? So we've got two sidebars here, which is a bit like an 1821 in Britain, and the shape of that inner bar there is very like British swords. So in some ways it's like a British sword, but you'll notice it has these little decorative, if we just come a bit closer, it has these little decorative bases to those sidebars, which is not something that you find on British swords generally. And the back strap's very interesting as well. The back piece or back strap, which is the steel piece which comes up here, you'll notice that that has a almost floral-like or leaf-like decoration to the pommel, which is not standard at all on any French sword that I know. It's just individual to this sword. So this, to my opinion, probably belonged, and again it's marked to, I think it's Culo and Co. of Klingenthal. Yeah, it is. So it's Culo, a good maker, based in Klingenthal. Châtellerault and Klingenthal and Saint-Étienne were the main blade making centres in France. And so this, in my opinion, was probably for an officer serving in North Africa who was perhaps a major or something like that, so kind of middle to high ranking, and again a very interesting sword with some of the similar features, coming back to the original one, some similar features but also some differences. But remember, even though we've seen three different, we saw the Toledo blade, we've seen the superior officer's blade here, double fullered, and we've seen the Cannula blade, they are all straight, of approximately the same length, usually about 32, 33 inches. They're all straight and basically thrusting blades. And that is, I think, like I say, while there are exceptions, that is something at this time, once we start seeing these non-regulation swords for infantry officers, and through to it being regulation from 1882 onwards, the infantry officers in the French army clearly thought that the use of the point was their principal form of attack and defence. So these are really dedicated thrusting swords. Although I have to say, I don't think they're necessarily the best guards, hand guards, for a dedicated thrusting sword. I would say if you look at a British scroll hilt, I think that does provide better hand protection. But that being said, something with only sidebars on the side is lighter, so it is going to be a slightly more nimble sword perhaps. Why they didn't checker the back straps, I still don't know. Answers on a postcard. So I hope that's been somewhat interesting. Obviously I mostly talk about the British Army and British military swords, but French military swords are super interesting. They're not as competitively collected as British swords are, so they tend to be cheaper, but it's a huge area. There's a massive area for research, I think, and it would be great to see more French researchers plunging in and looking at the primary source material, like Mary Mong. But seeing what else is written out there to explain some of these tendencies, some of these different blade designs. Some of them cross over with, like the Toledo pattern, they cross over with the British swords. Some of them, like the Cannula blade, very, very different to British swords. So yeah, fascinating. But again, we see parallels between the French army and the British army, because fundamentally they were in a similar situation in the 19th century. They were conquering, colonizing and policing, I suppose, controlling areas where people had lots of swords and sometimes wanted to use them to kill the invading overlords, whether it be in Afghanistan or India, or be it in Morocco or Tunisia. And so you end up with a similar situation of these officers in these places trying to come up with more effective swords. And it's a good reminder again that even at the end of the 19th century, swords were still being used. Even if they weren't mainstream in European warfare or American warfare, they were mainstream absolutely in some of these colonized areas of the world. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. Check out the link below to Max's fantastic article, and I'll see you again soon. Cheers, folks.